So we're going to start looking at how civil wars end. And so they can end with government victory or government defeat. They can end in some sort of negotiated settlement, or they can end in the parties kind of disengaging and violence sort of dropping below any sort of threshold where we'd say, yeah, there's a conflict happening. So we kind of think we know how these things can end, and we can certainly classify them appropriately. But the question becomes, why do rebels or governments choose to continue fighting, choose to pursue victory rather than sitting down and negotiating? And we'll talk about that from two different perspectives. Today we'll talk about the rational approach to that question about how civil wars end, and then later we'll pivot to a conversation about ripeness as an explanation for how conflicts end. And so from the rational perspective, I guess we'll start a step backward, thinking about how civil wars start from the perspective of bargaining theory. And so the idea with bargaining theory and its application to thinking about warfare is that you have two parties who disagree about some important thing, and they can negotiate about it. They can propose different ways to resolve that problem. And if they fail to reach a negotiated agreement, they end up going into warfare, which is going to be bad and destructive. And so they'd probably rather reach a negotiated settlement rather than have that happen. But they may disagree fundamentally about what's likely to happen in war. They recognize there'll be costs associated with it, but they might be overly optimistic about what they can get. And so I might be proposing what I think is a fair division of this problem, a fair way to resolve it. And you might believe that if this dispute ends up in warfare, that you're going to do really well. And so you look at my proposal that I believe is fair and conclude that you can actually do better with warfare, even with those costs. And those disagreements about what might happen should the conflict go to warfare can lead to a breakdown in that bargaining process, that we start with fundamentally different beliefs about what's likely to happen, and that leads us astray. And that then informs the conversation about how civil war ends. Because one of the things that happens when parties start fighting is they quickly realize whether those beliefs about what would happen when war breaks out, they discover whether those beliefs are founded or not. And they discover that they may not have be in a position to do quite as well as they thought. And suddenly negotiated settlements start looking better because that optimism sort of gets adjusted. And so one of the insights of the bargaining theory of war is that you can have a long period of bargaining it before the war. You have a short period of war fighting, and then parties may quickly pivot to the bargaining table again, having learned something about what's likely to happen if they continue fighting, and therefore pursuing an early and quick settlement. That is, I think, intuitive from the sort of logic of bargaining theory, but it doesn't actually explain what we see out in the real world, particularly with civil wars, where these conflicts can drag on for a very extended period of time. Now, rational choice theory might counter with ideas about commitment problems or deterrence as explanations for why these conflicts might drag on, and we'll actually explore both of those explanations in some detail later on in the course, particularly when we start talking about peacekeeping. But I'm going to propose a slightly different explanation for why this rational process of I've learned that maybe war is not going to go quite the way that I wanted might still produce a long, protracted outcome. And for that, I'm going to be drawing upon some insights from Charles King and his analysis of the Transnistria civil war, separatist conflict in Moldova that has drug on for, we're rolling into the 30th year, I think, of that conflict. And for that, he sort of steps back and says, well, the decision to end a conflict, either to just sort of walk away or to sit down and actually negotiate, has to be put in a much larger context. And so we could think about sort of a general model about the value of fighting for a particular actor, and I'll call that sort of utility of fighting. And I'll propose that the utility of fighting is a function of the probability that you're going to win, P with the B victory next to it. So that's what you would get if you won, the benefits of victory, times the probability that you get that. 1 minus P is, I guess, the probability of defeat, right? The other side of victory. And what would happen if you get defeated, the benefits of failure. And so you'll factor in sort of the logic of what's likely to happen in terms of victory and defeat. You calculate in the benefits you get from fighting. We'll call that loot. And so if you have a diamond mine, that you may not be able to access that diamond mine without the conflict, but certainly while the conflict is going, there's a huge amount of revenue flowing in. And then we'll subtract from that value, that utility, the cost of continued fighting, and that utility from all of those different factors has to play out in a way that makes negotiation or surrender seem appealing. And so if that utility equation ends up looking pretty good because the loot and the costs balance out in such a way that fighting actually looks pretty good, maybe you don't want to surrender. Maybe you don't want to negotiate, even if the probability of victory seems slight, but the probability of failure also seems slight. And so that's what King notes in the conflict in Moldova, is that you get these long-running conflicts not because parties are actually trying to achieve anything through warfare, but because the status quo has become beneficial. And so he talks about how Transnistria benefits from a robust smuggling operation that they get to tax, but also good chunks of the Moldovan economy are sort of tied into that smuggling network. And so disrupting the status quo would end up being really uncomfortable for lots of different actors. And so if the conflict ends up being stalemated, that neither side is going to achieve victory, the real question becomes whether or not the status quo is acceptable. And when there's large amounts of loot involved, or when the costs are relatively low, that status quo might be acceptable, and parties might be willing to carry on with that status quo for a very extended period of time, not because they've adjusted their expectations about what's likely to happen militarily from the conflict, but because they've adjusted their expectations about how much they actually need a settlement, given what conflict looks like, to the point where we might talk about some of these conflicts as being beneficial for the parties involved, because of the loot available and their ability to sort of manage the downside of conflict, reduce the casualties, reduce the destruction, and benefit from the chaos that comes from it.